Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I'm your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations with educational leaders and experts that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Emotional intelligence plays a crucial role in a child's education, yet balancing it with the essential academic standards can be challenging. And that's why we're thrilled to welcome our Keith Matheny, or as many people know him as Coach Rudy, a nationally recognized teacher, author, and advocate, and renowned for his commitment to promoting social, emotional, and academic development. Coach Rudy has significantly contributed to initiatives like the Aspens Institute Seed Council and A Nation at Hope report, and his work, which includes developing a highly regarded SEL seminar and founding the SEL Launchpad, which underscores the importance of merging emotional intelligence with academic excellence. So, welcome, Coach Rudy.
Well, thank you. I love this work, and I'm excited to visit with you, and I'm excited to kind of give your listeners a peek at kind of what the keynote's going to be about at the summit coming up in December.
Coach Rudy is going to be one of our keynotes at our MTSS summit here in December. And so we're just excited to kind of introduce you to our audience and give us a sneak peek into what we can expect to hear from you. So I have a couple questions to start with, but to start out with, we talk a lot about a social, emotional wellness around here, and particularly that emotional intelligence piece that, you touch on a lot. And so I would love for you just to maybe start out by talking about, like, for a typical high school freshman today, what kind of support do you think that they need to be successful in school and in life?
You gave me the perfect intro because, as you can see with my shirt, your EQ is really truly greater than your IQ. When we're talking about what really predicts our success and happiness in the world, it's way more about our EQ than our IQ. And another way to think about this in an academic setting is I talk to my students all the time and tell them high school's not about how smart you are, it's about how responsible you are. And so often in our schools, we talk about, be responsible. But there are a lot of skills that underlie the concept of being responsible.
Mm.
Being responsible means that you can prioritize important tasks, that you can organize yourself and keep a schedule, that you can, plan things out, that you can manage your emotions to keep them in check so that, you can be at the be able to perform when you need to perform. There's so many skills related to be responsible, and it's kind of like yelling at a kid, use the scientific method or calm down. You're talking about such a global big skill. We've got to teach those specific things underneath it. It's step by step. And what I really want to see is every child, especially as they transition, when they transition from middle school to high school or from elementary school to middle school, getting some real big supports around emotional intelligence, because the more we teach skills proactively, the less students are going to struggle with challenges and the less likely that those challenges will escalate to crises. It is proactive work, and skill development actually changes a kid's life forever, whereas just solving a problem for them is super temporary. And so we really want to help empower them with skills to face life's challenges. And that's going to be way more about their EQ skills than their IQ skills.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I just talked to somebody about executive functioning, and I think
Yeah.
some of that kind of plays into this. It's just so funny because it's in the top of my brain. But in that, we talk about emotional intelligence, but let's talk about, like, specifically, you mentioned, like, be responsible. So I would love to just kind of break that down just a little bit and talk about the specific skills, because as an educator myself, I can think of, a list of things that maybe a student might need. But in your mind, when you say, be responsible, what kind of things are we talking about for student developing?
There's a list of them. So what I want to do is just give you an example.
Okay.
So one of the more powerful lessons that my students talk about a lot from the work and the class that I teach and the curriculum I'm a co-author of, the work I do in schools, called Rocks in a Jar. And basically, the concept of rocks in a jar is that you have so much time, right? A fixed amount of time, we all do. And that fixed amount of time is the same for every human being. And in our days, we've got these things that can take time but aren't really important. We call those like beans. So they're like low priority tasks that take up our time. They might be things like watching social media, running through reels, playing video games that don't really matter to us, watching reruns, doing things that are time wasters that aren't really being productive towards what we care about. And then we have these things that are kind of what we call big rocks, the things that are important to us in our lives, like our faith, our family, our goals, our academics. And when we allow the little things to get into our time first, when we allow the low priority tasks to take up time first, we end up living a life where we are not completing our high important tasks, the ones that really matter to us. And we go to bed each night feeling like, oh my gosh, I missed these really important things. But what's really cool is if I just change that, and I just want to show you that I'm not changing anything else, but if I just
And
change
and
the order.
and for our audio listeners, he's pouring things into a cup.
So when I just switch and put the priorities first, when I put my big rocks first, the things that really matter to me, and then I allow those little things to fill in time gaps that are in between my priorities, what's amazing is everything fits. And so
Mhm.
for most students, if they can just learn the concept of prioritization, that if I figure out what's most important and put those things scheduled into my time first, I'm still going to have time for the little things. And what's great is when I'm playing those video games or watching those reels, if I've gotten my priorities done first, I'm playing those things and doing those things guilt free.
Yeah.
And so that's one of those lessons that really sticks with students that we talk about. And so many times, it's completely new to them to even think about what are priorities, what's most important, what do I need to get done. And a lot of times I'll use the video game analogy as well that, when you're playing a video game like Mario Brothers or whatever video games they play, but speaking this language to kids really works. There are some coins that are worth just regular points. And then there are some like glowing orbs that are worth like hundreds of points. And I tell them, just like when you play a video game, you prioritize those high point scoring orbs. It's the same thing in life. Life is like a really big video game where you're trying to prioritize the tasks that are going to move you the most quick towards your goals. And
Yeah.
this is one of those skills that really sticks with kids and it underlies being responsible. But there are way more than just that.
Well, I mean, I think that you're right, that just that simple idea of prioritization, that is so hard for some students to grasp because they may see whatever is in front of them as the most important, right?
And
I
they
always
do
said that.
that by brain development.
Oh,
Exactly.
yeah, and I think brain development, even just students that are neurodiverse, like, have a hard time prioritizing some of those different skills, and I was thinking about in middle school, I often would say I was a middle school teacher, and I would say, "They're only thinking about what's, like, right in front of their face." Like,
Exactly.
they
Yes.
cannot see more than that, like, they are very self-centered in that. I mean, that's just, like, brain development at the time. They're very focused on them, themselves, and their own perspectives, and so really helping them understand big picture, what are your priorities for the day? And so, I mean, what do you think, like, I guess the question is that what can educators do to, like, develop some of these skills, beyond just maybe that kind of SEL curriculum or like the building, those specific types of lessons? Are there things they can do in their everyday teaching that they can do that with?
So yes, and so I'm going to go
Mhm.
back and first I want to say that the way that I say that thing about students seeing things immediate and then seeing things long term is I say teens and tweens look at things through bifocals. They only see what's right in front of their face, what's immediate, what's going to happen right now. Whereas adults are seeing things through telescopes. They're seeing the long term implications of what happens now. And what we have to do is loan young people our telescopes. That's
Mm,
how they actually grow those neurons, because neurons that fire together wire together. That's how they build that prefrontal cortex that helps them see out into the future and become a better planner. But answering your question about how do we actually develop these skills, I think the first thing you said is exactly right. And then the second part is true too. The first thing, we have to have a research and evidence-based explicit instruction curriculum. Otherwise, we're not sure we're even giving them something that is useful. If we're just making something up on the fly, we don't know
Yeah.
if that's tested. If you go to a doctor and you say, hey, I really want to, lower my cholesterol. And he goes, well, I'll prescribe you a statin. And you're like, no, 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 I'm going to make my own statin. That's probably not a good idea. You want something that is research and evidence based, that has had some studies with it. And you also want something that has all the different components. You want, Spanish translations and, closed captioning. You want a scope and sequence. You want extensions. You want things that are going to really create a robust curriculum. Without a curriculum, you don't have common language, and you don't know if
Mm,
what you're doing is actually effective, because you don't know if you're drawing from the science or not. So I think curriculum is first. But then, yes, I think there's all kinds of integrated practices you can do in a classroom. So I'm going to go back and just use rocks in a jar as an example, because we all can kind of speak that way now since I taught that lesson. So I say, when you're teaching a skill, there's something called the four-way how. So the first way how is, I have to sell it. I have to convince you that this is important. The second thing I have to do is teach it. I have to take a complicated skill and make it simple. The third thing I need to do is practice it. I immediately practice it. And then last but not least, reinforce it. So with the rocks in a jar, I was selling it as I was teaching the lesson. We have priorities. We only have this much time. We need to make our time work. I would sell that. I'd get kids excited, like, we got to make the use of our time. Then I'd teach it using rocks in a jar. Then immediately I'd have them practice it. They do the rocks in a jar at their table, so they could see that analogy right there in front of them. Then they would make a list at their table of their top 5 big rocks, their priorities, and what are the 3 things that kind of get in the way of their priorities, that waste their time. I want them immediately to apply that lesson and practice right then. But then, if I was going to then reinforce that lesson, I might say at the end of every period, don't forget, put your big rocks first, get your priorities taken care of. At the start of every period, I might have announcements where I talk about, on my board, here's the big assignments that are coming up. I might, in my classroom, have a year-long planning calendar. Because remember, kids are not great at, this kind of long
mhm.
range planning. So I could have a year at a glance planning calendar with where are the ends of the 6 weeks, and where are all the final exams, and where are all the holidays, and keep referencing back to that, so that
Yeah.
they're really trying to make those connections. So that's that four-way how: sell it, teach it, practice it, reinforce it. But we've got to make it a commitment to that with time and energy in order for kids to grow skills. But the payoff is huge, because
Yeah.
if kids don't have these skills, then I'm constantly trying to offer retakes, and I'm constantly trying to help these kids that might all of a sudden fail my class, or might not get promoted to the next grade. Teaching these skills prevents proactively all kinds of crises down the road. So this work is a time maker, it's not a time taker.
Yeah. Well, and I would say too, it comes down to supporting. I think any leaders that are listening really like thinking about how do we support teachers in this work, or how do we build that kind of structure and prioritize that within a school or within a district, because you can't just have one teacher implement this and think
Oh
it's going
no.
to work. You have to collectively come together to be able to build these skills and to teach the curriculum. And I think providing that really high quality curriculum for your teachers, because I know as a teacher myself, it's like I'm to come up with my own SEL lessons or any of that kind of stuff. Or even if someone handed me that SEL, like, okay, where do I fit that in? Is but
Right.
making it a priority within your school is really essential, and making it easy for the teachers to do, right? Like the rocks in the jar is a great lesson, but if you don't have the rocks and the physical materials to maybe do that lesson, that's
Yeah.
really hard. And you
Yeah.
all have to sort of agree to using that same language to help
So
reinforce that everywhere.
this is the high leverage thing, is that common language. If everybody on campus is teaching the same language and teaching that same lesson, then it becomes common language on campus, and everybody can say, "Hey, it looks like you're not putting your big rocks first. You got to prioritize." We have those key phrases that we can use with students that remind them of a much deeper lesson. And then even better, we're talking in an MTSS format, and on an MTSS conference. we want a coherent narrative of language as kids go through the levels. So at
Yeah.
tier one, we're teaching that language of how to prioritize. Then at tier two, we might be giving additional supports and maybe even helping them do that, prioritize to-do list with ABC and 1, 2, 3. And maybe at tier three, we're meeting with them, regularly one-on-one to make that list for this week and doing a check-in and check-out. This is the kind of thing that we need, those buzzwords, common language, to be the same as you go through the tiers. So often you teach one thing at tier one, and then at tier two, you learn a completely different language. And then at tier three, you learn a completely different language. A kid's struggling to manage their emotions, and we teach something at tier one in advisory, and then they go at tier two and they get some supports, and the teacher, the counselor, whoever's doing that support, teaches them a completely different language, on how to
Yeah.
manage their emotions. And then at tier three, a completely different language again. We need a common thread, a coherent narrative through the levels of support. So we're all speaking the same language and just adding on additional supports.
Yeah. I think that's really key because and that's where that structure, that school-wide structure or district-wide structure is really important, and that has to start with the leaders, the
No doubt.
choices, you know what I mean? Like, because there's so many things so many times I have conversations on this podcast with different people, and, like, all of these are really great, but I think back to being a teacher in the classroom, and, like, the only way that this stuff gets implemented to fidelity is when the leaders are making it a priority. They help you create the time, provide the resources, because and I think back to those SEL lessons that I would maybe implement within my advisory, like homeroom time. And the ones that were most successful were when I had someone gave me the materials that I needed to do it. The slideshow was where it needed to be,
Yep.
and it was fairly easy to implement without a lot of time preparation on my part because you don't have that extra time. And so I think
Yeah.
those are the kinds of things is like we need to be able to help teachers implement these programs to support students because we know it's important. Because I
Yeah.
think any teacher is going to tell you, yeah, these are really important skills that students need to know. But it's
But where do
like,
I find the
where do I find the time to do
Yeah.
it?
And how do I do it? Yeah. And so I think you're exactly right. And really comes right back to Rocks in a Jar. There's a beautiful theme in our little podcast today because what we're really talking about is what do your administrators prioritize? And
Mm,
so often as administrators, we get stuck in prioritizing just reactive things. We're
yeah,
constantly firefighting. We're constantly firefighting. And we're never really putting our focus on fire prevention. And that is just such a huge failure of leadership. And so back to the rocks in a jar, you just need to think about how can I make these kinds of lessons and supports the big rocks on my
yeah,
campus. They
yeah,
can't be a bean. If we think that these are, an add-on or an extra, then they're never going to be the transformative thing that they can be, right?
yeah,
We need that kind of proactive planning and prioritization to really make it real. And like you said, we need to make it easy for the teacher by getting some kind of curriculum resources that are really easy to implement, and then having some kind of team on campus, especially if you're doing this in advisory, that is packaging the materials and putting them in teachers' boxes to make it easy for
yeah,
teachers to do it on that
yeah.
day.
Well, and I
However,
even yeah, I even think too, because, we talked a little bit at the beginning, like, we know that emotional intelligence is an underlining kind of, priority before sort of that, intellectual stuff needs to happen, right?
no
And
doubt.
so, like, we understand that if those academic outcomes that many districts and schools are wanting to see, they wanna see those happen, we have to be able to prioritize the things that are going to, like, make that possible. Okay, so I mean, we could dive into this. Just really wanted to give our audience a taste of what to expect in our summit, but I would love for you to share maybe a story about a student or a group of students who've benefited from some of this work that you've done.
There are so many. So
I
I
know, I
would,
was like, that's
yeah,
asking you to, like, pick a
yeah.
favorite child,
No
like
worries. No worries. So, I mean, I was a classroom teacher for over 25 years. I taught this as a dedicated course for many of those years. And so there's lots of my own students, of course, that I could tell story after story about. I had a student who was labeled an at-risk freshman, who eventually ended up being valedictorian and getting accepted to Harvard, and then did a TED Talk at Harvard, which is amazing. And in his TED Talk, he actually referenced the power of being in an emotional intelligence class in ninth grade. And I'll make sure you guys can find that TED Talk. It's by Daniel McCutcheon, and it's called "It's Okay to Not Be Okay." So Daniel McCutcheon
Mm.
TED Talk, if you want to watch it or hear about it. But there's so many others that it's truly like trying to pick your favorite child, where we're talking about Benny or Monica or Gabby, or hundreds of stories. And even like this morning, I had an email from a former student named Ian, who's talking about all the things, and he didn't have me since 2017. And he's reaching out to me 7 years later saying that class really impacted my life. But even more so, I think the impact that I'm seeing in the work is not really my students, but more my grand students. And what I mean
Mhm.
by that is, as I work with teachers and help them implement this work, they have students. And I like to think of them like my grand students. And I hear so many wonderful stories from teachers that do this work, in a very deep way. And it is about the classroom work, and that is definitely the case. But like you said, it's all about the district and the system work as well. We've got to create a meaningful space for this work. We've got to create a coherent narrative. We need to make it a priority. And then we need to go around celebrating teachers and catching teachers and students doing this right. This can't be a gotcha. It's got to be a congratulations, way to go.
Yeah.
That's just the way we've got to embrace this work. But I will say again, your EQ is greater than your IQ. If you really want to see a difference in this world with these work, we've got to build those emotional intelligence skills in kids.
Well, thank you so much for just being here to chat about this. I'm sure we could probably talk all day about the importance of this, and I think you're right. Is that really it is about building those structures, and so that's what my really hope is for people listening, is just that understanding that this work is possible to do, but the leaders can really take the lead, take the charge, and help um help teachers do that work and help the people that are on the front lines, because it does make a difference for students. It sticks with them. I think the fact that they're reaching out to you years later, seeing how some of those skills they build at a pivotal moment in their life can really change the trajectory of where they're going. And so I think, to me, if anything, that is more convincing.
Yeah. I want to thank Branching Minds for their work that they do in supporting these kinds of supports. And I want to encourage all the leaders listening, come listen to the keynote. Come to the Branching Minds Summit, but make sure you come and see my keynote at the end. We're going to be talking about how do we move student supports upstream, because you can't tier 2 and tier 3 yourself out of a tier 1 problem. If we
Yeah,
don't get tier 1 solved, if we don't build those supports proactively, we can never put enough supports at the reactive side. When the
yeah.
tier 1 tide comes in, all boats rise. So come on, I'll see you on December 4th.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Coach Rudy, and we look forward to your keynote at our summit. So,
All right. Bye-bye.
thanks for listening to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to hear all our future episodes. As well, if you're enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and let us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Branching Minds.